In 1847, in the sun-baked settlement of Cedar Hollow, Texas, an unimaginable event unfolded on the courthouse steps under a blazing sun. 5 young women stood in ragged gowns as men bellowed figures, treating them like livestock at a sale. 4 siblings had already been purchased to settle their father's betting debts, leaving only one, 16-year-old Sarah Jane, her emerald eyes fierce with resistance as the auctioneer's gavel lifted for the final bid. At that moment, a solitary man emerged from the onlookers, his worn face marked by grief, and uttered words that altered everything. "I'll marry her, not own her." The day had begun like any other in Cedar Hollow, with dawn inching over the plateau, casting elongated shadows across the main road. By midday, however, the whole town had converged around the courthouse, drawn by rumors that raced faster than flames through parched grass. Old man McCready had exhausted his fortune at the card table, and Sheriff Tom Wheeler was set to sell off everything he possessed, including his 5 daughters. Sarah Jane stood last in line, watching in anguish as her sisters were taken one by one. Elizabeth, the eldest at 22, was sold to a cattleman from a neighboring county for $50. Mary Ellen, 19 and soft as a spring breeze, was taken by a trader who eyed her like merchandise. The twins, Anna and Rachel, barely 18, were bought together by a saloon owner from a town 2 counties away. His motives as clear as the liquor on his breath. Now, only Sarah Jane remained, the youngest and most fiery of the McCready girls, standing alone on those courthouse steps. Her chestnut hair caught the afternoon glow, and though her dress was patched and faded, she held her chin high, her proud Irish heritage coursing through her. "Now, folks," shouted auctioneer Pete Larson, a lanky man whose voice rang across the plaza like a chapel bell, "we've reached the last of the McCready girls. Sarah Jane here is 16, strong as an ox, and can cook, clean, and tend a plot better than most women twice her years." The crowd stirred and whispered. Sarah Jane's cheeks flushed with humiliation, but she kept her gaze locked on the distant horizon, where the prairie grasses swayed, as if urging her to flee. She'd tried escaping once, at 14, but the desert nearly claimed her before her father found her, half dead by a dry stream bed. "Do I hear 20 to start?" Larson pressed, his gavel poised. "20," called Jake Harlan, a single man with a modest ranch outside town, notorious for his hot temper and swift punches. "25," came another voice from the rear. Sarah Jane shut her eyes, trying to picture herself elsewhere. Perhaps in the small cabin of her childhood. Before her mother succumbed to fever 3 years prior. Before her father drowned in cards and whiskey. Before their world crumbled like a structure built on dust. 30, 35. The bids volleyed like a shuttlecock, each number a hammer strike sealing her fate. Sarah Jane opened her eyes, scanning the crowd for any kind face, any hint of compassion. Most townsfolk averted their eyes, too ashamed to meet hers. Women gripped their shawls tighter, murmuring behind their hands. Men stared at their shoes or focused on the sale, treating it like any other auction. Then she saw him, standing apart near the hitching post where a black mare waited patiently, a man she'd noticed in town but never spoken to. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked with silver at the edges and lines around his eyes that hinted at both joy and sorrow. His attire was plain but neat, dark pants, a white shirt, and a worn black vest. She knew his name was Daniel Callahan, a widower who'd lost his wife and infant son to cholera the previous winter. 40. The voice was Morton Slade's, a man who owned multiple properties in town and was known for a cruel streak broader than the Rio Grande. 45. Jake Harlan countered, his face flushed with resolve and too much liquor. Daniel Callahan stepped forward, his boots silent on the hard-packed earth. When he spoke, his voice was soft but carried across the square like thunder before a tempest. 100. The crowd fell quiet. Even auctioneer Larson blinked, startled. His gavel halted mid-air. "Did you say 100, Mr. Callahan?" Larson asked, his voice wavering. "I did," Daniel replied, his gray eyes locked on Sarah Jane's face. "But not for what you're thinking." He approached the courthouse steps, each step deliberate and steady. Sarah Jane held her breath, not daring to hope but unable to look away from this stranger who'd just shifted the trajectory of her life. "I'm offering 100, Daniel said, his voice gaining strength, "and my name, Sarah Jane McCready, if you'll accept it. I'd be honored if you become Sarah Jane Callahan, my wife, not my possession, my partner, not my property." The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. This wasn't how things were done. This wasn't how auctions worked. Sarah Jane stared at Daniel Callahan, this man offering her something she hadn't had in years, a choice. She began, then faltered, her voice barely a murmur. "I don't even know you, Mr. Callahan." Daniel smiled, and for the first time in months, the smile reached his eyes. "No, Miss McCready, you don't. But I've seen you in town, noticed how you care for your sisters, how you hold your head high even when the world seems against you. I've seen your kindness to Mrs. Thompson when she was ill, how you always helped old Pete with his supplies without being asked." He paused, removing his hat and running his fingers through his hair. "I'm not asking you to love me, Sarah Jane. I'm asking you to let me give you a life where you're treated with the respect every woman deserves. We can sort out the rest as we go. Sarah Jane looked at the crowd, at the faces of people she'd known her entire life who'd stood by as her family was torn apart. Then she looked back at Daniel Callahan, this widower offering her something rare and precious, dignity. Will you? She hesitated, then found her courage. Will you treat me as an equal, Mr. Callahan, not as something you own? I give you my word, Daniel said solemnly, as God is my witness. Sarah Jane took a deep breath, tasting dust and possibility in the air. Then yes, Mr. Callahan, I'll take your name, and I'll do my best to honor it. The crowd buzzed, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others nodding with reluctant respect. Auctioneer Larson looked around, uncertain, his gavel still raised. Well, I'll be, he muttered. This is highly unusual. But if the lady agrees and the bid is valid. He brought the gavel down with a sharp crack. Sold to Mr. Daniel Callahan. But Daniel was already ascending the courthouse steps, extending his hand to Sarah Jane. Not as a master to property but as one equal to another. She took it, her small hand enveloped by his calloused one. Feeling something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Reverend Thompson, Daniel called to an elderly man in the crowd, would you perform a ceremony right here, right now? I want no doubt about Mrs. Callahan's status in this town. Reverend Thompson, a gentleman with a white beard and kind eyes, stepped forward. It would be my privilege, Daniel, and might I say, this is the finest act I've seen in Cedar Hollow in years. And so, on the courthouse steps where Sarah Jane had nearly been sold like cattle, she became a bride. The ceremony was brief and simple, witnessed by half the town and sealed with a handshake rather than a kiss. But as Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Sarah Jane felt a shift in her heart, the first stirrings of what might one day become joy. Daniel led her to his horse, helping her up behind him with careful hands. My place is about 3 miles out, he said over his shoulder as they rode away from the crowd. Nothing grand, but it's tidy and solid. You'll have your own room until or unless you choose otherwise. Sarah Jane wrapped her arms around his waist, marveling at how sturdy and warm he felt, how safe she felt for the first time in months. The wind tossed her hair as they rode across the prairie, and she found herself smiling despite all that had happened. Daniel's ranch was as he described, simple but well kept. The house was modest but clean, with a covered porch and windows that welcomed ample light. A garden behind the house held neat rows of vegetables and herbs, evidence of careful tending, and a barn sheltered several horses and a dairy cow. It's lovely, Sarah Jane said as Daniel helped her down from the horse, and she meant it. After the morning's chaos and shame, this quiet place felt like a haven. Daniel showed her around the house, pointing out the kitchen with its iron stove, the parlor with its stone hearth, and the 2 bedrooms at the back. He paused at the door of the smaller bedroom, his hand on the knob. This was meant to be the nursery for my son, he said, but it's yours now for as long as you want it. Sarah Jane heard the pain in his voice, carefully restrained but unmistakable. What was his name? She asked softly. James, Daniel replied. James Patrick Callahan. He lived for 3 days. They stood in quiet understanding for a moment, 2 people who knew loss in different ways. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat and continued the tour. That first evening, they sat on the porch as the sun sank over the prairie, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose. Sarah Jane had changed into one of the simple dresses Daniel's late wife had left behind. With his careful permission, it fit reasonably well, and after weeks in the same worn dress, the clean cotton felt like a luxury against her skin. Tell me about your wife, Sarah Jane said, watching the last light fade from the western sky. Daniel was silent for so long she thought he might not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. Her name was Catherine. We met at a church gathering in San Antonio, and I knew the moment I saw her she was the woman I wanted to spend my life with. She had the warmest heart and the most beautiful laugh. He paused, his hands clasped in his lap. We had 5 good years before the cholera came. She fought it longer than most, tried so hard to stay for the baby's sake. I'm sorry, Sarah Jane said, and meant it. It must be hard having me here in her home. Daniel turned to her, his gray eyes earnest in the growing dusk. Catherine would have liked you, Sarah Jane. She'd have been proud her home is sheltering someone who needs it. She always said this place was meant to be filled with life and laughter. Over the following weeks, they fell into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Sarah Jane took on the household duties, cooking, cleaning and tending the garden, while Daniel worked the ranch and made trips to town for supplies. They were courteous with each other, careful and respectful, like 2 people navigating something delicate. Sarah Jane proved to be everything auctioneer Larson had claimed and more. She could cook, crafting meals that made Daniel savor each bite after months of his own plain fare. She had a way with animals, coaxing milk from the cow and eggs from the hens with gentle patience. The garden thrived under her care, and she even nursed a sick foal back to health. But beyond her practical skills, it was her spirit that began to breathe life back into the ranch. She hummed while she worked, sang softly to the animals, and gradually began to smile more often. Daniel found himself eager to return home each evening to sit on the porch and hear her talk about her day. "I saw a roadrunner this morning," she told him one evening, her eyes alight with excitement. "He was chasing a lizard through the garden, and when he caught it, he held it up like he was showing off. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped the laundry basket." Daniel smiled, picturing the scene. They're proud little creatures. Catherine used to call them the jesters of the desert. It was the first time he'd spoken his wife's name without pain clouding his face, and Sarah Jane noticed. She was beginning to understand that healing, like trust, came in small steps. One afternoon, about a month after their unconventional wedding, Daniel returned to find Sarah Jane on the porch steps, tears streaming down her face, a crumpled letter in her lap. "What's wrong?" he asked, kneeling beside her with concern. Sarah Jane held up the letter with trembling hands. "It's from Elizabeth, my sister. She got word to me through the preacher in her town." Daniel waited patiently as she wiped her eyes and steadied herself to speak. "She says Mary Ellen tried to escape from the traitor who bought her. He caught her and—" Sarah Jane's voice broke. "He beat her so badly she can barely walk. And the twins, the saloon owner is forcing them to work in ways no decent woman should." Daniel's jaw clenched with anger. "Where are they?" "All of them? Elizabeth is the only one who's safe. The cattleman who bought her is kind and has offered to marry her properly. But the others—" She looked at him with desperate eyes. "I have to help them, Daniel. They're my sisters." Daniel stood, his decision firm. "Then we'll help them. All of them." Sarah Jane stared at him, stunned. "You mean that? Even though it might be dangerous? Even though they're not really your family?" Daniel reached down and took her hands, pulling her to her feet. "Sarah Jane, you're my wife. That makes them my family too. We'll find a way to get them out and bring them home if they want to come." The next morning, Daniel saddled 2 horses and packed supplies for a journey. Sarah Jane had never ridden alone before, but Daniel spent an hour teaching her the basics, his patience boundless as she learned to guide the gentle mare he'd chosen for her. "We'll go to Mary Ellen first," he decided, studying a rough map he'd drawn based on Elizabeth's letter. "She's in the most immediate danger." The ride to Miller Bridge took 2 days, and Sarah Jane marveled at how different the world looked from horseback. She'd rarely ventured beyond Cedar Hollow, and the vast Texas landscape stretched before them like a sea of grass and sky. They talked as they rode, sharing tales of their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Sarah Jane learned that Daniel had come to Graphite from Missouri after his parents' deaths, seeking a fresh start in open spaces. Daniel discovered that Sarah Jane had taught herself to read using her mother's Bible and a few books, and that she dreamed of seeing the ocean. "They say it stretches to the horizon and beyond," she told him as they camped the first night, "bigger than all the prairie combined, and blue as the deepest sky. Maybe we'll see it together someday," Daniel said, and Sarah Jane's heart fluttered at the casual way he included her in his future. They found Mary Ellen in a boarding house above the general store where her owner worked. She was sweeping the front steps when they arrived, moving gingerly as if every step caused pain. When she saw Sarah Jane, she dropped the broom and nearly collapsed. "Sarah Jane, is it really you?" Mary Ellen's voice was a whisper, and Sarah Jane saw the purple bruises on her sister's face and arms. "We've come to take you home," Sarah Jane said, dismounting quickly and embracing her sister gently. The trader, a wiry man named Prescott with cruel, narrow eyes, emerged from the store. "What's this?" "That girl's mine, bought fair and square. I've got papers." Daniel stepped forward, his presence making Prescott hesitate. "I'm willing to buy her contract." "Name your price." "She ain't for sale," Prescott said, but his voice faltered. "I've got uses for her." "I can see that," Daniel said coldly, his eyes taking in Mary Ellen's condition. "The question is whether you want to be paid for her release or explain to the sheriff why you've been beating a woman half to death." The negotiation was tense but brief. Prescott, faced with Daniel's calm authority and a growing crowd of curious townsfolk, agreed to release Mary Ellen for $30, more than he'd paid, but less than he might have demanded otherwise. Mary Ellen could hardly believe she was free. She kept touching Sarah Jane's face, as if ensuring she wasn't dreaming, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought I'd never see any of you again," she whispered as they helped her onto Daniel's horse. "I thought I'd die in that place." Rescuing the twins from the saloon in Dusty Creek was more complex. The place was rough and dangerous, avoided by respectable folk, and the owner, a man called Snake Harlan, was known for his volatility and unpredictability. Daniel spent a day observing the saloon, noting routines and seeking the best opportunity. Anna and Rachel were kept upstairs most of the time, only brought down in the evenings when the place was crowded with cowboys and drifters. "We can't just walk in and demand their release," Daniel told Sarah Jane and Mary Ellen as they planned from their room at the town's only decent hotel. "Harlan's got too many men, and he won't hesitate to use force." "Then how do we get them out?" Sarah Jane asked, frustrated by their powerlessness. Daniel was silent for a scented moment, thinking. Finally, he looked up with a faint smile. "We'll need help from the local law and perfect timing." Their plan was risky but straightforward. Daniel had noticed that Harlan left the saloon every Tuesday morning for business at the bank and other properties, taking his 2 best gunmen and leaving the place guarded by only a bartender and a few drunks. Despite her injuries, Mary Ellen insisted on helping. "They're my sisters too," she said when Sarah Jane protested. "I'm not staying safe in a hotel while they're in danger." On Tuesday morning, while Harlan was at the bank, Mary Ellen staged a dramatic feint in front of the saloon. As the bartender and patrons rushed to assist, Sarah Jane and Daniel slipped in through the back door and up the stairs. They found Anna and Rachel in a small, filthy room at the end of the hall. Thin and frightened, their eyes hollow with despair. When they saw Sarah Jane, they collapsed into her arms, sobbing with relief. Quickly, Daniel urged, helping the twins to their feet. "We need to be gone before Harlan returns." They escaped the building and reached their horses without incident. But as they prepared to ride out, shouts rose from the saloon. Harlan had returned early. "Ride!" Daniel shouted, and they galloped out of Dusty Creek, the sound of pursuit growing behind them. The chase stretched across miles of open prairie, with Harlan and his men gaining on the group. Daniel's horse was fast, but the others carried double loads, and Mary Ellen was still weak. Just as capture seemed imminent, a cavalry patrol from Fort Davis appeared, led by a young lieutenant named Carter. He quickly assessed the situation and positioned his men between the group and their pursuers. "This is U.S. Army business now," Carter told Harlan. "These people are under our protection." Harlan protested, claiming his property was stolen. But without legal papers, his claims fell apart. Faced with the Army's authority, he and his men retreated. The lieutenant escorted Daniel's group to the nearest town, where they rested before continuing. The journey back to Cedar Hollow was slow, accommodating Mary Ellen's injuries and the twins' weakened state. But their spirits gradually lifted. Anna, the more talkative twin, chattered endlessly, while Rachel grew brighter each day. Daniel was tirelessly patient, cooking, standing guard, and never complaining about the extra mouths to feed. "Why are you doing this?" Rachel asked one evening by the campfire. "We're not really your family. You barely knew Sarah Jane when you married her." Daniel looked at Sarah Jane, who was tending a cut on Mary Ellen's hand. "Family isn't just blood," he said quietly. "It's about choice, about standing by people when they need you, no matter the cost. Your sister chose to trust me with her life, and I chose to honor that trust. That makes you my family too." Sarah Jane's heart tightened with an emotion she was beginning to recognize as love. This man, who asked only for companionship and respect, had risked everything to save her sisters, giving them a future when they had none. When they reached the ranch, it felt like a true homecoming. The house, once spacious for two, became cozy with five. But they made it work. The twins shared Sarah Jane's room, while Mary Ellen took the spare room Daniel had used for storage. Everyone contributed, and the ranch ran smoother than ever. A month later, Elizabeth's husband, the kind cattleman who'd bought her, brought her for a visit. The reunion of the five sisters was tearful and joyful. "I can't believe you saved them all," Elizabeth said, shaking Daniel's hand. "I don't know how we'll ever thank you." "Just be happy," Daniel replied. "That's thanks enough." As autumn faded into winter, the household found new rhythms. Anna discovered a knack for horses, while Rachel excelled at sewing. Mary Ellen, her wounds healed, took over cooking, becoming the group's caretaker. The ranch brimmed with laughter and life, fulfilling Catherine Callahan's dream. But the quiet moments between Daniel and Sarah Jane held the deepest meaning. They grew comfortable beyond politeness, Sarah Jane watching for Daniel's return each evening, Daniel lingering over their porch talks. One December evening, under the first snowfall, Sarah Jane found the courage to speak her heart. "Daniel," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." He turned, his gray eyes attentive in the lamplight. "What is it?" "Sarah Jane, I've come to care for you more than I expected, more than gratitude or friendship." She took a deep breath. "Our marriage began as a deal to save my life and give you companionship, but it's become more for me." Daniel was silent so long she feared she'd misjudged. But then he took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "Sarah Jane," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I started caring for you the day I saw your courage on those steps. Every day since, that care has grown. I didn't want to pressure you, didn't want you to feel obliged." She faced him fully, and he smiled, his withered face transformed. "Now, I'd like to kiss my wife." "If she's willing." She was. Their kiss was sweet, built on respect and affection, sealing their emotional bond. That evening, he gave her his grandmother's ring, an emerald with tiny diamonds, saying, "Not to replace Catherine, but because you found your own place in my heart." "I love you, Daniel Callahan," she said. "And I love you, Sarah Jane Callahan," he replied, pulling her close. "More than I thought I could love again." Spring brought new beginnings. Mary Ellen announced her engagement to Dr. Mark Estate, the young doctor who'd treated her and fallen for her gentle spirit. Anna and Rachel were courted by two kind brothers from a nearby ranch. In late spring, Sarah Jane confirmed she was pregnant. The news brought joy and fear, recalling Daniel's first son's death. But Dr. Tate assured them of a safe delivery. "This child will be born into love," Sarah Jane said one evening, her hand on her stomach. "Into a family that chose each other." Daniel covered her hand, marveling at the life beneath. "Catherine would have loved this," he said. "She'd have loved seeing this house full of family." "Tell me about her again," Sarah Jane said, never jealous, knowing love for the past didn't lessen the present. Daniel smiled, his eyes distant. She said love wasn't a pie, with less for each person. It was a flame, growing brighter when shared. Summer brought weddings, Mary Ellen's to Dr. Tate in the garden, Anna and Rachel's to the Morrison brothers a month later. Sarah Jane, visibly pregnant, stood as matron of honor, radiant with happiness. The frightened girl from the courthouse steps had become a confident woman surrounded by love. Elizabeth and her husband moved closer, and the Callahan ranch became a hub of family and friends. In October, Sarah Jane gave birth to a healthy son with Daniel's gray eyes and her stubborn chin, named James Patrick Callahan in honor of Daniel's first son. As Daniel held him, tears falling, Sarah Jane touched his face. "He's perfect," Daniel whispered. "We're all perfect," Sarah Jane said, looking at her sisters, their families, and the man who'd won her heart. "All of us together." Years later, when James Patrick asked how his parents met, Sarah Jane would smile. "Once upon a time, in a dusty town called Cedar Hollow, something wonderful happened, disguised as something terrible. That, my darling, is how our family began." The ranch prospered, growing with more children. Daughters with Sarah Jane's green eyes, sons with Daniel's calm nature. The house expanded but remained warm and welcoming. Sarah Jane never forgot the lessons of that courthouse day: dignity must be fought for, family is chosen, and the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures. She and Daniel raised their children with these truths, ensuring they understood freedom's value and responsibility. On quiet evenings under the Texas sky, Sarah Jane would look at Daniel, remembering the man who offered his name, not ownership, and feel the power of a single moment to change everything. The courthouse still stood, but such shameful auctions ceased. Laws changed, the community learned, and the Callahans helped transform not just their story but their towns. Elizabeth became a rancher and women's rights advocate. Mary Ellen and Dr. Tate founded a hospital, Anna bred fine horses, and Rachel opened a dress shop serving 3 counties. Sarah Jane, the last sister left, became the heart of it all, turning a terrible experience into a foundation of love and strength. By accepting a hand offered in friendship and building it into love, she not only saved herself but saved them all.